I live in Ontario and we've had a heat warning for the last 3 days. And next week is supposed to go up to 42 degrees. Oh my God, it's so hot. Hey there, welcome back to my bedroom. Today we're talking about the founders of AA and kind of how it found its place in our society. I'm going to mostly talk about the founders, Bill Wilson, and Dr. Bob or Robert Smith, as well as a little bit of the Oxford group and a little bit about how it kind of found its place in our society. There's a lot of opinion in this video, but I did do research on the history. I'm not going to get into like every minute detail of history, so I will link the sources that I found this information from below if you want to look more into it. So the story of AA begins with Bill Wilson. Bill had a challenging childhood. He was abandoned by his parents when he was just a child, so he grew up with his maternal grandparents. He struggled with depression his whole life, and then his childhood ended with his first love dying at age 17 due to surgery complications. So trauma at an early age, poor home and family life, challenging mental health. Bill had a lot of risk factors for developing substance abuse problems. He was even kicked out of university for a hazing incident with a couple of his friends, but was reinstated in 1916 when the Mexican expedition happened in the States and he needed to go serve. During military training, Wilson had his first drink, and it was only a month later where he was regularly and routinely blacking out. Bill married his wife, Lois Wilson, in 1918 before serving in World War II. After serving in World War II, he and Lois moved to New York to live. There's a rumor that Bill couldn't graduate from law school because he was too drunk to go and pick up his diploma at the time. In 1933, Bill was committed to the Charles B. Towns Hospital for alcohol and drug addiction 4 times under the care of Dr. William Silkworth. Dr. Silkworth is the doctor who wrote the letters in the big book called The Doctor's Opinion. Dr. Silkworth taught Bill the theory that alcohol was a physical allergy and an obsession of the mind. Bill gained hope from this knowledge, but it didn't help his problem. Eventually, he was told that he would either be locked up permanently or wound up dead. In 1934, Bill met up with Ebby Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher had been sober for a few weeks at the time under the guide of an evangelical Christian group called the Oxford Group. The Oxford Group was a Christian fellowship movement founded by Dr. Bookman. The Oxford Group was a Christian evangelical group that was popular in Europe and the US in the early 1900s. It was founded by Dr. Bookman, who summarized the core philosophies of the Oxford Group with the 5 C's: confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance. Members practiced self-improvement by taking personal inventory, admitting their wrongdoings, making amends, using prayer and meditation, and proselytizing or telling others about their message. Shortly after meeting Ebby Thatcher, Bill went to Townsby Hospital for his 4th and final stay. During this stay, he was undergoing treatment with what was called the belladonna cure, which is when he experienced his white light spiritual experience that convinced him to quit drinking. Earlier that evening, Thatcher had visited and proselytized and convinced him to give himself over to the care of a Christian deity who would liberate him from alcohol. He said he asked for God to show himself in an act of desperation and then felt an overwhelming sense of ecstasy and bright light. The belladonna cure, by the way, is a form of treatment that they used to do, which uses Atropa belladonna, which is a deadly nightshade, like it's a plant. The belladonna cure, by the way, was a treatment where they used a deadly nightshade called Atropa belladonna that was used to treat mental health issues. It's extremely toxic when ingested, and it caused delirium and hallucinations in its patients. Belladonna had unpredictable effects in each patient, and therefore the dose was based on the physiological response to each patient. The mixture was given every hour, day and night, for around 50 hours, and the end of treatment was marked by basically a lot of shitting. an abundance of stool. The treatment was also described as the puke and purge. So Wilson joined the Oxford group after meeting Ebby Thatcher and stayed sober. During a business trip, he almost relapsed and decided that he needed to reach out and talk to another alcoholic. This led him to be introduced to another Oxford member group, Dr. Bob Smith. Wilson shared with Bob how he was only able to remain sober after a spiritual experience. Bill eventually left the Oxford group, but a lot of AA structure is formed from the ideas of that group. Many of the teachings from the Oxford group helped form the 12-step program, and Bill W. has been quoted saying that the Oxford group saved his life. In 1938, after about 100 alcoholics had become sober, the group decided to publish its program in the form of a book. Wilson was chosen as the primary author. The book was called Alcoholics Anonymous and included a list of activities for spiritual growth, called the 12 Steps. The movement soon adopted the name of the book, and shortly after, Wilson wrote the 12 traditions to ensure the survival of any individual group. At the end of his life, Bill rarely attended meetings. As a heavy smoker who eventually suffered from emphysema and pneumonia, Bill was known to still be smoking even while on an oxygen tank. He drank no alcohol for the last 37 years of his life, but it's said that in his last days he made demands for whiskey and became belligerent when he was refused. In the 1950s, Wilson used LSD in medically supervised experiments. Later he wrote to Carl Jung, praising the results and recommending it as validation for Jung's spiritual experience. Bill was enthusiastic about his experience. He said it helped him remove many barriers to experiencing God. Bill is quoted as saying, "It's a generally acknowledged fact in spiritual development that ego reduction makes the influx of God's grace possible. If therefore, under LSD, we can have a temporary reduction so that we can better see what we are and where we are going, well, that might be some of the best help. The goal might become clearer. So I consider LSD to be of some value to some people and of practically no damage or danger to anyone. It will never take the place of any of the existing means by which we already have to reduce the ego and keep it reduced." So not only had Bill, one of the founders of AA, experimented with the belladonna plant and LSD, he's also rumored to have been a huge philanderer and womanizer within the program. Frances Hartigan, AA biographer and Lois Wilson's secretary, states that Bill began an affair with Helen Wynne, who was 22 years his junior. In 1963, Bill renegotiated his royalty agreement so that he could include 10% of his royalties going to Wynne and 90% going to Lois. In Bill's story, he admits there had been no real infidelity, for loyalty to my wife and extreme drunkenness kept me out of those scraps. Rumors followed him through his life, though, about the accuracy of that statement. Innocence by technicality, a lie to protect Lewis. It's worth remembering this was in an age where many wives would just turn a blind eye to their husband's sexual philandering. A lot of biographies and stories about the AA Foundation and about Bill W. and Lois have been scrubbed and sanitized of any kind of infidelity. It's not something they want in the history. Bill's popularity in AA circles was enormous. People treated him like a messiah or like a rock star. But especially when he was in his sober years in AA, he was a huge womanizer. His flirtatious and adulterous behaviors filled him with a lot of guilt, according to some old-timers who were close to him, but that didn't really stop him from wandering off the path and behaving that way. Bill also had people who didn't like him, who accused him of betrayal, of power-mongering, of lacking principles, and even of being insane. Susan Cheever wrote a detailed exploratory look into Bill W. It begins, "Bill W. was no saint. He smoked like a chimney and acted like a pig, cheating on his wife and demanding whiskey on his deathbed." Bill's behavior and his tendency to gloat to his other male members is what invented the term the 13th step. a saying for when old-timers prey on the new incoming and young new-timers. I'll link an article down below that talks more about 13th stepping. So that's a little bit about Bill W. And as we kind of talked about, he met Dr. Bob in AA. And Albert Smith, Dr. Bob, and Bill are the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. So talking a little bit about how that started, we'll get into Dr. Bob's story. As a child, Dr. Bob's parents brought him to 4 religious services per week. In response, he vowed that as an adult, he would never attend a religious service. Smith began drinking in university and quickly discovered that he could recover easier and quicker than a lot of his classmates. He was a member of a fraternity and drank heavily for years after graduating. His drinking started causing problems with work and with returning to school. The university required that he remain 2 extra quarters and that he remain sober as a condition of graduating. Smith became a hospital intern and was busy enough to avoid heavy drinking for several years. But in 1915, he opened his own office and went back to drinking heavily again. He was encouraged to quit by the passing of Prohibition in 1919, but with medicinal alcohol and bootleggers, he found that he did not lack the access. For the next 17 years after that, his life pretty much revolved around getting drunk and subverting all of his wife's efforts to get him to stop drinking. In 1933, his wife, Anne Smith, attended a lecture by the founder of the Oxford group, Dr. Buckman. For the next 2 years, she and Bob attended meetings regularly in an effort to subvert his drinking. But this was not successful until he met Bill Wilson in 1935. As I said before, Bill was on business in Akron and was struggling with this business that was not successful and concerned about relapsing, and he knew that he needed to talk to a fellow alcoholic. Recognizing the danger he was in, Bill reached out to the Oxford group, and he was put in touch with Robert Smith, Dr. Bob, by Henrietta Seiberling. I'm probably saying her name wrong. One of the leaders of the Akron Oxford group. After talking to Bill W., Albert Smith stopped drinking and only relapsed a month later. Returning to Akron, Bill gave him a beer to steady his nerves, and that was the last drink that Bob Smith ever had. His sobriety day, June 10th, 1935, is considered the foundation and the first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill and Dr. Bob wanted to create a program to help even the worst off alcoholic. They needed to empathize with those struggling and convince them of their powerlessness and hopelessness. They believed that those who were active in addiction and active alcoholics were dealing with insanity instead of dealing with being a sinner. Both men immediately set out to work with alcoholics at Akron's City Hospital, where one patient quickly achieved complete sobriety. Though the name AA had not been coined yet, these 3 men actually created the nucleus of what was the first AA group. In the fall of 1935, a second group slowly started to take place in New York. A third group popped up in Cleveland in 1939. It took over 4 years to produce 100 sober alcoholics in 3 founding groups. In 1938, Bill's brother set up a meeting with Leroy Chapman, an assistant to J.D. Rockefeller. The hope was that they would receive large funding from this millionaire for their new program, but instead wound up receiving only $5,000 and a $30 per week stipend for whatever Bill and Bob needed for the program. In 1940, Rockefeller doubled down, saying that AA should remain self-supporting, non-professional, and a fellowship by word of mouth instead of by funding. And honestly, thank God for that. Early in 1939, the first edition of the Big Book was published, explaining the philosophies and methods, the core of which is the 12-step program. It included case histories of 30 recovered members. From here, the development of the program was rapid. The same year, the Cleveland Plain Dealer released articles about AA, and just a few months later, membership had grown to over 500 members. An article about AA was carried by Liberty Magazine in the fall of 1939, which resulted in 800 phone calls asking for help. Attention was drawn to the book, and by the end of the year, membership had reached about 2,000. In 1941, the Saturday Evening Post ran an article about AA, and the response was enormous. By the end of that year, membership grew to about 6,000, and the number of meetings grew, spreading across the US and Canada. By 1950, 100,000 recovered alcoholics could be found worldwide. By 1946, it was possible to draw conclusions about the best suited attitudes, practices, and functions for AA group survival. These principles became today's 12 traditions. So by the 50s, the earlier chaos of the program had dissipated quite a bit. During this 10-year period, Dr. Bob devoted himself to hospital care of alcoholics and to indoctrinating them into AA's principles. Large numbers of alcoholics received care at St. Thomas, a Catholic hospital, and therefore a lot of sufferers found AA through medical care. This set a precedent where AA could cooperate with both medicine and with religion. In 1950, AA held its first international convention in Cleveland that was attended by around 6,000 people. Dr. Bob made an appearance at the conference and spoke about keeping AA simple before dying later that year. The following year, the New York office expanded to new groups to service hospitals, to service prisons, and other things as well. They started publishing standardized pamphlets and information for AA, as well as started the publication of the AA Grapevine. A second convention was held in 1955 to celebrate the 20-year anniversary of the program. It was at this convention that Bill W. handed over the custody and care of the program to the conference and the trustees. A note on the anonymous part of Alcoholics Anonymous. Anonymity was practiced at first because of the stigma of being an alcoholic and the experimental nature of the new fellowship. Bill W. was concerned that if members made public their affiliation to the program and then went out and began drinking again, it would threaten the reputation of the program and possibly even the survival of the fellowship. Later, Bill determined that the deeper purpose of anonymity was to prevent alcoholic egos from profiting off of fame and fortune off of Alcoholics Anonymous' name. So after Bob Smith's death in 1950, things for Alcoholics Anonymous moved fairly rapidly. In 1953, Narcotics Anonymous began using the 12 steps and 12 traditions in their own program. In 1966, an AA member was featured in a movie. And in 1971, Bill W. passed away. AA membership topped 1 million in 1976, around the release of the third edition of the Big Book. In 1989, a movie called My Name is Bill W. was released, which was a story about the AA program and the AA story. It would be 2001 before membership reached 2 million members, and the growth rate for Alcoholics Anonymous has been under 1% for the last 2 decades. Most statistics you'll find will say that the membership is still just over 2 million people. Recovery rates are always hard to decipher because of the vagueness of that definition. Everybody considers recovery something different. The lack of reporting of data and reporting of sobriety, and whether that's long-term or partial or whichever, and personal perceptions of what I might consider recovery may look very different from what you think recovery is. AA being a spiritual fellowship, they consider working the program, attending meetings, and celebrating sobriety to be successful recovery. That's fine for some people, but in all of the statistics that I've read, that only works and that only is considered recovery for 5 to 8% of every person who tries Alcoholics Anonymous. As AA became more popular, it started to see some special composition groups that some people looked at as problematic or suspicious. 4 of the prominent composition groups included women, LGBT, Black people, and young people. Acceptance for any of these groups did not come easily or quickly in Alcoholics Anonymous. It was founded in a time where de facto discrimination against Blacks was accepted, and LGBT orientation was seen as sexual deviance. Up until even the 1970s, Black people were allowed to attend meetings, but had to sit in the back and were not allowed to contribute or share during the meetings. It wasn't until 2001 where the head office in New York started to create conference-approved specific pamphlets for Black and BIPOC people, 60 years after. Some of these groups don't even have specific and separate categories on the AA directory online, or in all honesty, a lot of the reading that I did about these 4 composition groups made me feel pretty gross, because AA is so widely accepted and considered inclusive. I haven't even explained to you the whole history of the program and how it started, just bits and pieces here and there and like the meat of it. And it's still pretty clear that it is catering to a cishet white male membership. During the almost century since it was founded, we see a lot of pro-AA positive information in the media. It's positive members in AA in movies, or positive magazine adverts, or positive stories from ex-members on podcasts, or just such high esteem for this program and such like praise for it being the path to recovery. At the exact same time, there are millions of people who have tried this program and had it not work for them, and then have been made to feel like a failure, or been made to feel like it's their fault that they don't believe in a higher power and that this program didn't work for them. Entire decades have gone by now without any public criticism of the program or the harm that it perpetuates. I haven't explained the whole history or gone super into depth because honestly, if I were to go crazy into depth on this, we would be here for hours, and I don't make documentaries. I'm explaining this though because I think a lot of members don't realize how, and even non-members don't realize how AA was formed, and how, yeah, it's changed slightly since the inception of it, but a lot of the core philosophies and foundational principles still remain. Also, partly to illustrate that even though AA claims to be inclusive and non-denominational, it was literally designed and built from an evangelical Christian group, and its philosophies and steps are based on being a sinner and confessing and owning up and giving your life over to God. I think this is part of the reason that I felt so motivated to make this series. I get so frustrated with the argument from current members that Alcoholics Anonymous is spiritual and not religious, because they really this is the hill that they feel like they need to die on. It's the same conversation every time, and I feel like that is not helpful for somebody who is new in sobriety and clearly expressing that this program is not working for them. I don't want somebody else who's trying to get sober being made to feel like it's their fault that they don't believe in a higher power, and it's their fault that they're not working the steps because they're not trying hard enough or they're not desperate enough. You can't force faith-based belief on yourself. That's not how brains work. I can't just decide to believe in a higher power or religious values just because somebody else says that that's the path to recovery. That is never going to work for me. I think it's helpful for those who are struggling with knowing if AA is for them to understand how it was developed and why it's become so popular. I think it's also helpful to know that the founders of AA were normal people who were struggling with addiction and were doing the best that they could. It doesn't mean that those two men had the right answer for every one of our 8 billion people on the planet. Next video, I'm going to be discussing how I've been handling recovery in quarantine and a global health pandemic. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with sobriety and recovery while the globe is just a raging dumpster fire and things are falling apart all around us, and how to manage that with the additional mental health stress that we've all been facing. It hasn't been easy, but we're all managing. we're all making it through. And if you are continuing to fight and continuing to push for a better version of yourself and continued sobriety through this, I commend you, and that is not going unseen. So next week we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about my experience with it, and I'll try and give some suggestions for what I've been doing. But until then, stay safe, reach out, and I will see you next week. Bye. So the story of AA begins with, oh gosh. So the story of AA begins with, fuck you. In 1933, Dr. So classy. Which caused hallucinations.